Good afternoon, everybody, from sunny Bratislava and other countries and cities from where our speakers are now. I hope everybody managed to connect to our webinar and can hear at this moment only me well, but I hope our speakers as well. My name is Alisa Mazurk. I'm a research fellow at GlobSec Policy Institute. It's a Bratislava-based think tank committed to enhancing security, prosperity in Europe and throughout the world. And first of all, I hope that all our viewers and listeners staying safe, staying healthy, and staying home. And I would like to thank you on behalf of GlobSec for joining and following our activities online. So now we're gonna start our discussion, which is devoted to the situation in the EU neighborhood, and namely resilience of the EU neighborhood amid COVID-19 outbreak. So during our discussion, we will focus on two regions, the Eastern Partnership region, the 6 countries, and the 6 countries of the Western Balkans. If we look in general at the global numbers of the COVID-19 spread all around the world, we see that actually the EU neighbors are not ranked at the top of it. But we understand that these regions are more exposed to the external shocks, and their systems are less resilient to cope with additional crises more than the EU member states. A lot of countries have a lot of different situations and crises ongoing, such as frozen conflicts or actually active conflicts. In most of the countries, the institutions are not very strong and still struggling to cope with this crisis. The healthcare systems are also less developed than most of the EU. So we would like to discuss the situation on the ground, how these countries are going through this developing so far COVID-19 crisis, and how they are already prepared to mitigate the possible consequences, obviously the economic consequences, the social, possibly we can discuss even the political consequences. So time is of essence here, and we understand that the EU support at this point will be of strong importance. So now I would like to turn to my great panel, and I'm thrilled to be joined today online by such distinguished speakers. And I would like to introduce Katarína Mathernová, Deputy Director General at DG Neighbourhood and Enlargement Negotiations. DG NEAR. Hello. We have also with us Vlado Vilčić, Member of European Parliament, who is the chair of the delegation to the EU Montenegro Stabilization and Association Parliamentary Committee. And he's also a European Parliament standing rapporteur for Serbia.
Hello, and very happy to be here in this important time. Thanks.
We have Sonja Licht with us from Serbia. She's the president of the Belgrade Fund for Political Excellence.
Great to be with you people today.
And also we have Nico Popescu, director of the wider Europe program at the European Council on Foreign Relations, who will join us unfortunately only by audio due to the technical issues. Hello, Nico.
Yes, I'm here. Hello, everyone.
Yeah. So, and before actually turning to our speakers and starting our discussion, I would also like to address our online audience and inform you that you have also a possibility to submit your questions via the chat option in the section of Zoom, if you're connected via Zoom. If you are connected via online stream, you can also put the questions in the comments. So please submit your questions and we will look through them in the second part of our discussion, and we'll be able, hopefully, to raise some of them. To remind you, we have a discussion during 1 hour today until 3 p.m., so you still have time. Okay, so to start, I would like to address first Ms. Sonja Licht, and who's based in Serbia, I guess in Belgrade now, on the confinement. There has been a lot of discussion recently, in particular on the case of Serbia, because there have been some statements made on the lack of European solidarity. And if we look also at numbers, we see that Serbia is one of the most affected countries in the Western Balkans, and that there are quite a few of cases. So could you please provide us some general overview of what the situation on the ground, maybe what the measures have been taken so far, and how you see how the government is coping with this crisis, maybe not only Serbia, but also in the neighborhood. Thank you.
Well, once again, thank you for inviting me to this discussion. I think, of course, we are all aware how important and how challenging these times are. We are all facing a phenomena we did not expect. We can't say that it is completely new. We had some pandemics before, but nothing compared to this one. And of course, the entire Western Balkans was as unprepared as everybody else, unfortunately. Although there were many who were sending very clear signals that something like this might happen. And I would say the problem really, or problems came out of unpreparedness and also, of course, of problems within the healthcare, public healthcare, which in many ways, I must say, is for the time being, it seems coping with the growing numbers. You are right, I was looking at the Johns Hopkins University database this morning, and Serbia is the second after Romania as far as numbers are concerned of the infected people, but also of the deaths. So this is quite an issue to be analyzed, of course, in the future. But definitely what one can say is that I think that there were different shocks. First, there was, of course, a stage of denial when it said this is nothing so serious. This is, again, not unique for Serbia or the Western Balkans. Then slowly it started sinking in that the situation is getting very, very worrisome, and the narrative changed. But when the narrative changed, it also represented or reflected a kind of shock with the lack of European solidarity, even the solidarity between the EU countries. And we all know that this was a shock for everybody in the first days. I must say the Commission had a different narrative, but the individual countries, as we know, started closing down very quickly, even among themselves, not only to the neighborhood or the vicinity, immediate vicinity. And then, of course, came the famous statement of Aleksandar Vučić, where he praised China, who jumped in immediately and was in fact very critical about the lack of European solidarity. Now, I must say, of course, we all know that China did not jump in immediately only in Serbia. It is present throughout the region and much broader. And I say that there are basically, in my opinion, two processes going on. On one hand, it is an offensive of goodwill coming from China. Let us remind us that 1,000 ventilators were given a few days ago to New York, much more than the entire region, for example, according to CNN. But in the same time, this is also, I would immediately say, an offensive of soft power. And there is no doubt that both things are going hand in hand. The attitude toward the European Union, of course, worried many of us. I must say the narrative is changing after a few days of the first planes that arrived from China. It was said that the transport was paid by the EU. It was said that $94 million euros, were renamed from the IPA funds. For example, what I find a problem is that I'm sure that when you say funds renamed from the IPA funds, the majority of the citizens don't have a clue what you are talking about, that this is the real money which is being given to Serbia in this case, because otherwise, because of our lack of absorption capacity, we wouldn't get that money at all. So there is a change, but it is very, very slow. Now the third actor who jumped in was Russia, but I can't even say that they jumped in. They came quite late. And it is also interesting to note that Russia has the humanitarian center in Niš, which, by the way, in 2014, during the flood, was very quick. This time we didn't hear anything from the humanitarian center and its activities. Now, as far as internal situations are concerned, more or less, we are all living under some kind of emergency rule. In Serbia, it is quite tough. We who are older than 65 were the day when the state of emergency was declared, were ordered to stay at home. And I think that it must be one of the reasons why, in fact, the percentage of the deaths was, for the time being, or in the first part of the growth, much slower. For this age group now, it is growing. Also in this age group, 65 and beyond. What I think should be underlined here is that, of course, the states of emergency are a situation where many things are going against basic full respect of basic human and civil rights. Some things can be understood and some things are crossing the line. And this is where I think it is very, very important, especially from the Commission, European Commission. I hope today's meeting will also send a very serious message that these states of emergency or emergency situation declared as simply could not anyway. Should I get?
Could we kindly ask people to mute their microphones when they don't speak?
Yeah.
Colleagues, could you please mute your microphones, everybody except for Sonia?
And I got rid of my video to make sure. The problem is mute. Okay, I'll try to continue. So I think it is extremely important now to have a full presence, as full as it is possible, both from Brussels and the EU member states as well, in sending serious messages on one hand of full solidarity, which is started to happen. Second, messages that in fact there are conditions still on the table, and that we need to behave as a candidate country, which is expecting opening of a new chapters when it will be possible, hopefully as soon as it is possible. I think that what was done with the finally opening the accession talks to Macedonia and Albania is very important. Long due, as we all know, but it was good to be done even in this very, very critical situation. And I must say that what needs to be, I think, a special attention paid also to two things. One is internal freedoms, especially independent media, which are under very, very serious threat of simply running out of any funds and stop their existence. This is very serious as far as internally. And then there is also something else which needs to be underlined, the absolute necessity of more regional cooperation, especially in the field, as when this crisis is over, of crisis prevention, hybrid security. Finally was confirmed is not what we thought, hybrid security is only. It is very much about this kind of crisis. It is very much how we will prevent further pandemics to spread. This is how I would. Thank you for your attention.
So much, Sonia. It was really a thorough explanation of the situation, and you already even offered the possible solutions. And from one region to another, now I would like to turn to Nico Popescu. And here I would also like to turn to your recent piece, which you wrote on how coronavirus threatened the geopolitical Europe. And maybe you could also elaborate a bit more on that, how the outcome of this crisis might shift the priorities of the EU from its region to coping with internal crisis. And please, the floor is yours.
Hi, thank you. I haven't become yet a coronavirus expert, but I'm doing my best to keep up with the debate. So I will share some observations on how the crisis manifests itself in Eastern Europe, and some of them are the following. Now imagine how bad the situation is in France, Italy, Spain, and many of other countries. And now imagine how bad it is likely to become in the next couple of weeks in the Eastern Partnership countries, where it's not just that hospitals are poorer and the healthcare system is poorer, but generally all the institutions are poorer, they have fewer resources, fewer capacity, they are messier, more chaotic, less competent than the institutions and not just the healthcare systems in much of the EU. So the situation is going to be very, very difficult in the near future. The wave hasn't arrived yet, but if we look at the statistics of COVID cases in the Eastern Partnership, what I see is that the hardest hit per capita are Armenia and Moldova. So for example, Ukraine has 1,300 cases and Moldova, Armenia have 800 cases. But basically, Ukraine is more than 10 times bigger. So if you look on a per capita basis, Armenia and Moldova are 5, 6, 7 times more, have higher infection rates than Ukraine for now. And of course, what we also know is that the testing capacity of these countries is very, very weak. So all of these statistics, they are very approximate and very relative. And of course, the real number is much higher. If you want, I spoke a bit about weak institutions and not very competent institutions, but just to give you a few snapshots of how some of this played out in Moldova, but presumably, such similarly disorganized responses are not just a Moldovan speciality these days. So in the last 2 weeks in Moldova, you had one day the president saying that, don't worry, COVID is just like a flu. It will pass through most people and you won't even notice. You'll have some, you'll feel like a flu for a couple of days and it will be over. So while the government was saying, stay at home, make sure you don't pass on the virus, the president was saying, it's not a big deal, don't worry, things are gonna be fine. Then a few days later, they go into the opposite direction and they put armored vehicles on the street with machine guns. You had the army involved in the management and helping in a lot of countries now, but getting machine guns onto the streets does not serve any obvious purpose. Then the Moldovans went into asking everyone to stay at home, but then as of today, they called on all the public sector workers to go back to work. So whereas all the countries are closing down and trying to enforce and toughen up the lockdown, as of today, the Moldovan government is calling public sector employees back to work. So you get this kind of conflicting messages, which are not likely to help. And if you change strategy every 3 days, it's definitely, and you neither opt for the herd immunity methodology that Britain tried to apply for a while and Sweden is still applying. But if you switch between strategies every 3-4 days, it's not going to help to fight it. And on some of the statistics, if we again refer to Moldova, things are basically quite bad, because I looked at the data. For example, in Italy, you get 15% more or less of infected, with people infected with COVID were doctors, whereas in Moldova, the number is 30%. So 30% of all COVID confirmed cases are actually doctors. Very quickly, you get situations, you have a similar situation in Romania, where you get sometimes several dozen doctors infected in an area or in a hospital, as is the case in North Romania. So basically, the whole healthcare system is paralyzed in specific parts of the country. Against this background, what you read in the news is a lot of coronavirus-related information, but of course, the real world is not waiting, and there is a lot of geopolitical and pretty brutal domestic politics going on across the region. Later this year, Moldova and Georgia should have elections, and the election campaign hasn't stopped. And that will have implications in the future, of course, for their foreign policy. Another very important dynamic that we pay much less attention than we should or we would otherwise had is this whole Russian-Ukrainian dynamic around Kozak and Yermak, the new plans. So something is happening. It's not very transparent, but the international community, for somewhat objective reasons, is not in a position to closely monitor that. We also see, and that might have implications down the road, of which we will probably learn later. What also didn't stop was this conversation inside the EU about the Eastern Partnership. And in the run-up to the communication that was published on the 18th of March, you had something of a battle between the member states as to how ambitious do you get in this new phase of Eastern Partnership. And there was a very strong pushback against the Eastern Partnership, almost an attempt to push the European neighborhood policy in Eastern Europe back to where it was in 2002 and deprive it of political and security ambitions. There was an attempt to refocus the Eastern Partnership. And by saying this, it's not the European Commission, it's not Brussels, but some member states basically led the charge at a pretty aggressive depolitization and desecuritization of the Eastern Partnership, an attempt to focus it on environment, connectivity, youth exchanges, which are all very worthy goals, but it's also a very kind of socio-economic type of agenda that the European Union used to have until 2002 and until 1999 when Solana was appointed High Representative. So, there is still an ongoing, if you want, political guerrilla warfare against the Eastern Partnership as an attempt to depoliticize it. And it's kind of, you don't see a lot of that in the Commission communication, which comes pretty strong on this resilience wording, but it couldn't go beyond resilience. And there was even a clash inside the EU on whether the Eastern Partnership should have anything to do with things like cybersecurity. So when we talk about security, it's not just, defense and border guards, but there was even a pushback against the EU having higher ambitions in helping the Eastern Partnership deal with cybersecurity threats. So all of that conversation will, of course, continue after the coronavirus crisis hopefully dies out. On China, I think, in a sense, what the month of March showed in terms of, this soft power positioning between the EU, Russia, and China in the Eastern Partnership was that the month of March was the worst time for the European Union to react. Hello, do you hear me? Is it okay?
Yes, we do, but
yeah.
If you could please make your last statement and we will, sorry, just we're limited by time.
Yeah, that's fine. I'll stop here, and if there is more, we can talk about it at the questions and answers.
Okay. Thank you so much, Nico, for such a broad description of the whole situation and the implications. And I think now it's time to turn to the EU Commission representative and with a reply on your statements. But also, I would like to turn to Katarína and also say that, in the recent days, we've heard some accusations also that there is not enough of EU solidarity, both within the European Union, and also we've heard that from the neighbors. I wouldn't quote here, but you can guess who I mean by that. So could you please elaborate more what are the current EU Commission initiatives to help its neighbors? And also, as Nico already raised the issue of Eastern Partnership, and I can see already a question raised by David Stulik precisely to you on how is European Commission going to revise the latest new Eastern Partnership proposal in the light of coronavirus, and if yes, in what way? Regulating funds, revising priority interventions, etc. So if you could please elaborate also a bit more on that, as we know there is an important days for Eastern Partnership, and the upcoming June summit, whether it's going to happen and what are or it's going to happen online. Maybe there are also some discussions on that. So please, the floor is yours.
You're turning it over to me?
Yes, yes.
Yeah, sorry, I was disconnected for a little bit. I apologize.
Okay, so probably, and then you missed my question because it was turned to you precisely. So we already have a question from the audience from David Stulik, who is wondering if the EU Commission is going to revise the Eastern Partnership proposal in the light of the coronavirus. If yes, in what way? Regulating the funds, revising the priority interventions. What are the future vision of the initiative, also the upcoming June summit, whether it's going to happen or not? And if you could please elaborate also more on in general, the initiatives to help neighbors to tackle the current crisis and maybe mitigate also its consequences already. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. And sorry, I was for some reason now I went to my iPad because my phone decided to disconnect towards the end of Nico's intervention, and great to be with you all. Let me first address a little bit the Eastern Partnership, then the Western Balkans, reflect both on David's question and on Nico's intervention and on Sonja's intervention, and then tell you what in fact is coming out and going to be published tomorrow. First, let me just say that I also very much hope that all of you are, and your loved ones and families and friends are okay. I also want to say that I don't think I've ever worked this hard as the last 3 weeks, non-stop, because the thing that's coming, and I'm going to get to it at the end, we have been extremely intensely, in fact, reorienting the funds that we have and repurposing already dedicated funds before seeing whether we can reorient it towards COVID response, and essentially reprogramming our entire assistance, whether for the Balkans, whether for the neighborhood, towards COVID response, both to address the immediate liquidity needs as well as the early recovery when hopefully the crisis will be beyond its peak. And we're trying to do it together with the member states and together with international financial institutions. We're doing it under a Team Europe concept, so they're actually to go a little bit of a way to overcome not only the actions, but also quite a lot of disinformation that is out there about the EU response. So I'll get to that at the end, just to give you the contours. But before that, let me just react on two things, on the Eastern Partnership and on the Western Balkans. First of all, with the Eastern Partnership, not to disagree with Nico, which I would never dare to do, but I think that about a year ago, really the future of Eastern Partnership hung in the balance, and it wasn't clear whether it really is going to have that strong, meaningful future. And really, that has changed. I don't think that I can say that there was really a strong pushback by a number of member states against having a strong framework for the future. What it does not have is a framework of a political future of integrating into the EU. But I think that the concept which I personally pushed for of resilience actually does include the security aspects, and specifically the disinformation and hybrid were the main reasons why we wanted to have this work, because it addresses from societal through economic, through environmental, through hybrid, through disinformation, resilience in broad sense. So I think the pushback might have been episodic, but it wasn't that strong anymore. I think a year ago, definitely, but I think that there was very much a recognition that that's important to engage with the partners in the East. And I think the greatest example is the Project Envy, where some member states were saying, why don't we have something similar to Eastern Partnership for the South, for the Southern neighborhood? In other words, recognition that it's a valid and important framework. Now, the Eastern Partnership, why am I talking about it in the context of COVID? The Eastern Partnership communication was in fact adopted at the first virtual meeting of the College of Commissioners. So it was the first week of quarantine when on the 18th when it was adopted. So it didn't get as much traction as it could have otherwise, but we did manage to reflect the unfolding COVID crisis in it, and on that basis we are now, as I mentioned, launching a major reprogramming exercise. I'm on the phone with ministers of finance from the whole region, and we are trying to, in fact, construct rescue packages together with the IMF for the countries, because the Eastern Partnership, as Nico pointed out, and it applies also to the Balkans, is in a fairly difficult situation, maybe not in the extreme of Italy and Spain or the US now, but with much weaker institutions, with much weaker health systems. And even when you look at the East, you have sort of two bookmarks of countries. You have, on the one hand, the good class Georgia, that in fact acted one of the earliest countries and completely stopped the country, and it's going to have terrible economic costs. Maybe not as many affected or dead people, but huge economic costs. On the other hand, you have Belarus, where they still have hockey matches today, and where the message is very much that this is, nothing's really happening. And then you have the countries with, as Nico was saying, very confused messages in between and inconsistent public messaging. So what we are trying to do is to repurpose things to come up with solid packages. And if somebody is interested in further discussion on that, I'm happy to elaborate. Now, on the summit, still a discussion. Me personally, I think we should have a virtual ministerial meeting and move the actual principals meeting to the fall, but there is no agreement on that yet. And this very much applies not only to the Eastern Partnership Summit, but the Zagreb Summit in the Balkans. There in the Balkans, we have, as Sonja mentioned, we did get finally agreement on opening negotiations with North Macedonia and Albania, which we are very, very happy about. We are preparing the negotiating framework and hope to open the negotiations soon. What we are doing in the Balkans as well, and I'm in fact in DG Neighbourhood leading on the effort of reprogramming and repurposing all of the assistance for all of the geographies, and what's going to come out is tomorrow a communication which will not only have figures that is hopefully going to be more understandable just than saying IPA is getting reprogrammed. Hopefully we'll be able to communicate about it better. but it also going to have concrete examples of what we have done in the different countries. So I like the comment. Well, I noted the comment, Sonia, when you mentioned that China is doing things out of, I forget the term that you used, but good heart or goodwill gesture. I think that I'm not sure I would go as far as describing it as a goodwill gesture. I mean, this is a geopolitical positioning. And when you combine it with the amount of disinformation that originates both in Russia and in China about COVID and about the EU and about what is happening, I am not sure that the word goodwill would necessarily then be in the same sentence. But every comment about the EU response being equally confused or not as focused the first week, 2 weeks, 10 days is very well taken. Partially, it originates from the fact that the health system is in exclusive competence of member states. So we don't even have the mechanisms currently. Hopefully in the future we will. And on the EU side to mobilize resources, to mobilize coordination mechanisms. But by now I think we are getting there. For the internal bid on Thursday, 100 billion euro package was put together on supporting the reinsurance systems for short works programs. And what we are coming with tomorrow is the communication on the support for the external action. And I'll just use the example of what we have done in Serbia, specifically, paying for 5 Boeing flights to transport 348 tons of emergency medical supplies and mobilizing the 93 million support package plus 15 million emergency supplies. So it's 15 million for emergency supplies and 78 million for socioeconomic recovery. And so we go down and have these figures for all the countries, which I'm not saying it's going to be fully sufficient, but I think that I have never seen a quicker reprogramming and reorientation exercise than we have now. So hopefully it's going to hit the target, and I very much hope that we'll be able to change the narrative a little bit as well. But I very much take any comment that we have not been initially well equipped to do that, precisely for this area hitting in part of coming from a situation where at the EU level we had very few, if any competencies, and when you don't have a legislative competence or when you don't have a policy competence, you also don't have the bureaucratic mechanism to use it. So we had to really make major reallocation of resources, staff, etc. I became acting head of the support group for Ukraine in addition to my day job, because the head of the support group for Ukraine was requisitioned to coordinate the supply of medical equipment to member states. So there are actually shifts also of this sort to be able to be responsive. I'll stop here and happy to elaborate if there are questions.
Thank you so much, Katarína, for your intervention and finding time in your busy schedule to join us for this discussion. It's really sounds very overwhelming. And now we would like to turn to representative of another EU institution, Vladimir Bilčík, who is a member of European Parliament and is a very active voice on the Western Balkans. So if you could please tell us more, Vlad, on what's the initiative of European Parliament, what's your take on how the Western Balkan countries are coping with this crisis? And also just, I see a question in the chat, which I might raise to you if you're willing to respond. It comes from Andrei Matisak, the journalist, who asks, as Miroslav Lajčák was recently appointed as the European Union Special Representative for the Belgrade-Pristina dialogue, what can he do in the times of coronavirus? if you could elaborate on that, please welcome.
Thank you very much, and greetings to everyone. Greetings to my distinguished co-panelists. It's always a pleasure to discuss these issues in such an excellent company. And also, this is an excellent timing, so I want to congratulate GlobSec for this initiative, because I think we need to have this discussion. And if we cannot be on the ground in the Western Balkans, and I think this is the most frustrating thing for me at the moment, so we cannot be on the ground. We have to try to reach out through all the means we can to talk, to communicate, to work with our partners. I think this is the key, and this is something which we have been trying to do from the European Parliament. There are many creative ways of how we can do this, and I think this is something which at all levels of EU institutions, but also member states, we ought to try to do, because it is important that we don't lose the hearts and minds of the people in the region. And I think this is a big health crisis, but it is potentially a tectonic change in the way we organize our international relations, and we cannot lose our neighborhood. This goes for the Eastern neighborhood as much as the Western Balkans. And I've been very concerned about particularly this dimension in the crisis. There will be life after we overcome the big peak of COVID-19, and I hope that that life will indeed continue on the firm European foundations when it comes to the Western Balkans. I want to underline what has been said, and we in the European Parliament have very actively supported the EU enlargement. I think it's important that despite the COVID-19 crisis, we have seen important decisions in the region which underlie the European perspective. Yes, we may not come for picture and photo opportunities with large airplanes in the first instance, but we have been in the region for a long time during worse and better times, and we'll stay there, and we are committed. I think this is the key message. I'm very glad indeed that the initiative to open up accession talks with Albania and North Macedonia did take place despite the crisis. It's an important signal to the region. There is a real new dynamic to the enlargement negotiations. The two front runners will at last be pushed to run because they haven't been running. They have been basically sitting in the same place, not moving very much, namely Serbia and Montenegro. I think if we can get this dynamic from the ground and moving, if we can get as many as 4 countries negotiating the EU accession, we can see a whole new dynamic once this crisis is over. I also want to underline that what's important is that the region stays firmly anchored in the West in terms of security. And we should mention that North Macedonia entered the North Atlantic Treaty Organization just a few days ago. And this is also an important signal in the region. The West is engaged more broadly. It's just not just the European Union. It's also the biggest security and defense alliance we have. And we should just mention that. Yes, and I said this already, the European Union perhaps wasn't the quickest when it came to either the reaction on the ground or the publicity. And part of the reason is that the European Union is made up of states. We are a union of states. And although the EU institutions already warned the member states of a potential spread of COVID-19 across Europe in January, many member states either didn't listen or didn't really commit to any major measures. So we were all taken a bit by surprise when the crisis came, especially in Italy in the first place. And it did take us a while to react. But I also want to underline at this point, and by now we have reacted in a way which I think is not only underlying the commitment to the long-term European perspective region, but also the commitment on the ground in very tangible ways. The airplanes have started to come and have landed even in Belgrade with deliveries of the help financed by the European Union. We have shown a great deal of flexibility when also we MEPs in the European Parliament adopted measures in the last plenary which extend and enlarge the scope of the EU Solidarity Fund when it comes to the Western Balkans. The governments in the region have their hands untied when it comes to the use of IPA funds. I think this is also important. And yes, there is a package of help, of both immediate help when it comes to boosting technical, the medical supplies in the region, and also the help which should help with the bearing of the socio-economic consequences of the crisis. So all of these measures have been taken, and we in the European Parliament have watched them very closely. I want to also make sure that I underline that although we cannot meet physically in Brussels in Parliament, I'm constantly through social media in touch with my fellow MEPs in the EPP group, which is the largest group. And today we are sending a big letter of our support and congratulations to Miroslav Lajčák, who just on Friday was appointed the EU special rep for the dialogue between Belgrade and Pristina, and also for the other regional security issues in the Western Balkans. I think it's important we show this support to him at the moment. This support has to be across the political aisles and across the member states. Andrej Matišak is asking what can Lajčák do at the moment. Well, I think it's an important signal that he has been appointed. It is a bit of a frustrated appointment because he cannot be on the ground. But I think it's important to underline that he will be on the ground as soon as the situation allows it. And he's already in a very hot communication with all the stakeholders. Also, we MEPs will be talking to him and have been in touch. And I just want to say that he's ready to step in. I think the COVID-19 crisis is a real challenge, but it's also, as Sonia Licht was saying, an opportunity to pick up on regional cooperation. It cannot be resolved unless there is dialogue between Pristina and Belgrade. I was happy to see some pieces of news even today coming from Belgrade that Belgrade is ready to reach out to Pristina and to talk about coordination of the efforts to fight the spread of the virus. And that's very important. Maybe a couple of things which I want to underline, and I'll leave it to the questions. I am, as an MEP, besides working on the Balkans, I'm also a full member of the LIBE committee, which looks at the fundamental rights, democracy, and the protection of the basic freedoms and values. I'm also part of a monitoring group, which was established in the aftermath of the murders of investigative journalists in Malta and Slovakia, and that group has dealt largely with issues of democracy, human rights, and basic freedoms. We just agreed last week in our group to meet weekly online and monitor the developments across the member states. And I've also pushed for including the countries around the EU, the developments in this area as a result of all the emergency measures taken up in response to COVID-19. So we will be monitoring the situation. I have been in touch directly with the Serbian authorities and expressed some of my concerns directly about the situation on the ground. I was pleased to see the release of an investigative journalist who was taken arrest in Novi Sad, and I'm also glad that the initial proposal to have a law passed censoring the media in this time has been withdrawn by the government. So indeed, we are watching the situation. We will be watching it, and we will be communicating on the ground. I'm really planning to continue in my also active engagement with the media, writing op-eds, giving interviews. I think one of the big challenges immediately ahead of us is to really get through the Easter vacation. I think this is going to be a big challenge. I want to underline it. We have the Easter vacation in our part of Europe, the Catholic part of Europe, if I may say so, a bit earlier. I think the Orthodox Easter will be a challenge. I'm getting news from my friends in Serbia that although hard measures have been put in place, a lot of people are not obeying them as much as they could. And this is also part of the frustration on the side of the government. And I think unless people start behaving responsibly, the numbers in Serbia will continue to rise and the system will be under a lot of stress. So I also want to send this message here to the public in the region. Please be responsible. Please obey these rules. We don't have a pill. We don't have a treatment for COVID-19. All we have is prevention, and we should be responsible when it comes to prevention. So all in all, this is where I'd like to end and maybe leave some space for questions and a discussion. I really appreciate this opportunity, and I think and I hope we can continue this also beyond this webinar, because I can see time is running out and we have hardly started discussing. So thanks again.
Thank you so much, Vlado. Indeed, it's like we are running out of time and we are just starting. So thank you all for your very interesting intervention. And if I may, to summarize, I think we will have probably time for just one question. And if you could provide your feedback on that. It's something what I'm looking through questions which are coming from audience, and it's something what I also wanted to raise, and it's something what all of you actually touched upon is a matter of communication. We all understand that the perceptions matter in politics, perceptions matter in geopolitics, and we see already the actions of third actors undermining our unity inside European Union, undermining the trust in institutions in the neighborhood, undermining the trust in EU and its institutions. So I would like to quote also my colleague Daniel Milo, who is dealing with disinformation, contraction of disinformation in Globsec, who is saying that there is a new type of virus upon us, and it's not corona. And this virus cannot be stopped merely by social isolation, face masks, and disinfection. This virus is disinformation, it's malign activities. I would say it's not new because we have seen it for years, right? It's been just evolving, and in these times of crisis, of ongoing crisis, it's probably twice more dangerous and harmful because it literally can cost humans' lives. And I would like to ask you maybe to elaborate more on what can be or what are already efforts done, maybe on behalf of EU Commission, on behalf of civil society, expert community, and what we can do more together to counteract these activities. And here comes also the question from Pavel Havlicek from AMO, who is exactly asking, and he asks to address it to Katarína Mathernová. And do you think you could tell us more about what are the main beyond the immediate challenges related to the crisis of public health? Is EU coming up with bolstering the democratic component, checks and balances, and support to independent media, as well as responding to the disinformation spread by China and Russia? And we can see the level of repression in Belarus and Azerbaijan aimed at the opposition and critical voices in society. So if you could please elaborate more on what can we do, how to shape this narrative positively and in also on our side, because it has been, a lot has been done, and as Katarína said, that the EU is working 24 hours and there is a lot of efforts being made, but unfortunately people on the ground do not always see that. So what are we missing and what can we do to improve that? Who would like to start, please?
Very quickly, since we are running out of time. There are 4 areas that we are concentrating on. One is the emergency and provision of personal protective equipment, ventilators, etc. So that's the emergency thing. Second, we are investing in boosting the health systems institutionally. So there is working with the WHO and others to help with that. And we also are redoubling our efforts to support civil society, where the civil society acts as service providers at local level of health services, local services, etc. Now, the biggest, in terms of amounts of money, the biggest chunk goes to the economic response, and that's twofold. One is to help the treasuries with macro-financial assistance, with the simplified budget support. So the treasuries that are running out of money because of the fallout of tax and other revenues, and then directly supporting via the international financial institutions, supporting the liquidity needs, especially of the SMEs, but not only the SMEs, also larger companies and the most vulnerable groups, which is the self-employed. So that's the biggest chunk of money. Now, what we have specifically not cut and continue with is the support to the NGOs and the civil society and independent media, because very much we feel that support should not be cut at this moment. On the contrary, but we very much depend on the watchdogs and on the NGOs and the international groups, etc., to be monitoring the governments as well. That's not something that we can do. All we can do is provide financing to private groups to do that. So I very much like what Vlado Bilčík was saying, that also the parliament is looking at this as well. And the last thing I want to mention, which I forgot to mention in my initial intervention, specifically for the Western Balkans, that in the response to COVID, we actually broke some some taboos internally, and, for example, made Western Balkans part of the joint procurement of medical equipment, something that was unimaginable before the crisis, and now we just did it. And now when medical equipment will be purchased, the Western Balkan 6 are going to be part of the EU 27, both in terms of bulk purchases as well as the redistribution mechanism. So I'm not saying that that's going to be the biggest answer, but incrementally all these things I do believe will help.
Thank you so much. And I would like to turn to Vlado also to provide your feedback on that.
Thank you. I just want to compliment with a couple of sentences. I think it's important. I think it's very clear, and here I would like to also congratulate the Commission, Katarína, her team, the Commissioner, for doing the work they've been doing. I think she's absolutely right that despite the crisis, many of us have been really working perhaps even longer hours than we usually do in Brussels because of the technologies. It's often more difficult to connect, to negotiate, and to take decisions, but decisions are being taken, and the Commission is really leading the practical efforts to help the countries on the ground. I think where we are still lacking, and we really have to be better and stronger, and this is where we'll need everybody on board, including not just the institutions, but the member states, it's the communication on the ground. I also would like to commend the efforts that the EU delegations have been really showing in recent weeks in Belgrade and in Podgorica. I've watched very closely. Those are the countries I'm working on, and I also we want to congratulate the two ambassadors we have there and their teams. They've really been working day and night. And I think what we need to now do is to spread the message about what Europe is doing in a way which is understandable to the people in the countries, the people on the ground. I think we need to really talk about the specific examples, the specific stories. Just the numbers will not help. We need to have a very clear communication, and this shouldn't just be done by the people from the institutions, but we also need the help of the representatives of the member states on the ground. Some of this is already happening, but we need more of this. And of course, the European Parliament, we in the EP will continue to do this, but I want to urge everybody to do the same. This is the only way, and that's my last sentence, we are going to win also the propaganda war, the war against disinformation which we are facing in the region. And in some parts of the Western Balkans, this is a real challenge, particularly with China riding high. I want to remind everyone, had it not been for China in the first place, for the Chinese inept actions in the first place last December and this January, this crisis probably even wouldn't be here now. So let's remember that when we praise China next time. And I think we need to give all the credit to our European actions, because we can only overcome this as Europeans together. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Vladimir. And I would like now to turn to Sonia. And I also would like to raise another question which came from the audience. It's also connected to the whole disinformation communication campaigns. So you mentioned that Russia is not really visible in Serbia and in the region these days, and while China has been more visible. Is it about lack of Moscow resources or the interest?
That, of course, I don't know, but well, they became visible in Serbia from a few days ago, but obviously they are facing bigger problems than they are admitting. So I think that is the first reason. But I really don't know what could be the other reasons. I only want to return to this, what Katarína said about this offensive of goodwill. I mean, that I said goodwill and soft power, because that is what I think is very important. In fact, they are playing a very clear geopolitical game. And I think that this is against a problem that many people in the region and in Serbia will not be able to understand without having a different kind of information as well. This is why I mentioned the position of the independent media, and not only centrally, but locally as well. Now, when you ask about communication, I think that is extremely important. I tried to touch on it in the first intervention. I think it is really important how you put it, Katarína, not cutting back civil society and media, because in fact, I think it is quite necessary right now also for the civil society to help to spread your messages, to spread in the first place what you are doing. And this can also be done very clearly locally. My own organization has a quite big local program on development. We are in communication with our partners, and I must tell you, I mean, although the local level is much more difficult to reach in getting also info out, I think there is a readiness. The pressure is much less present there than in the centers as far as also information is concerned. So this is a very interesting time as far as I can say, and what you told that will come out as a communication tomorrow with the real stories. And this is what Mr. Vučić was also mentioning, winning the hearts and souls. China is doing everything to win the hearts and souls of people, and we need more from you people. Of course, you are not on the ground because you can't be, but you can be present in different ways. And if I can only say a sentence about Miroslav Lajčák, I think it is a very good news. He knows the region very well, and the region knows him. Plus, let us not forget, he speaks perfect Serbian, Serbocrat. He can reach out to many people, also himself, with his messages, and I am sure that the very fact that also for the future of the relationships, dialogue, and the relationship between Serbia and Kosovo.
Thank you so much, Sonia, for your elaborations. Nico, do we still have connection with you? Because I saw you were disconnected.
Yes.
Yeah.
I'm still here.
Yeah. Could you please also elaborate your side and on Eastern Partnership, also on the way the European Union is portrayed in partnership countries, and how it how it's seen in these times of crisis, and what can be done to improve this image?
I think until 10 days ago, it was very bad in many ways. The perception of the EU, all this egoism being shown on TV, the lack of assistance to Italy, even the fact that actually COVID came into Moldova, Ukraine, mostly through Italy as well. So there was a kind of pretty bad feeling around the way the EU has handled that. But with the rapid mobilization of the EU in the last less than 2 weeks, with the assistance packages announced, I think the situation is improving when it comes to the image of the EU. There is a slight pushback against China, and just to build on what was previously said, China plays a big responsibility in the way the crisis was not contained early on. I think they only acknowledged that the crisis jumps from humans to humans only on the 23rd of January. And another kind of foreign policy element to this Chinese mismanagement was the fact that they also apparently impaired the reactions of the World Health Organization, which was also slower in pointing how big a crisis this was. The World Health Organization wasn't actually let to go into Wuhan to try and see what is the situation on the ground back in January. So there's a big share of Chinese responsibility for the way the world, and even the World Health Organization, did not warn the rest of the world as to what is really happening. On the European Union, I think when we talk about this visibility of the foreign policy of aid assistance and masks, the EU is at this stage in a pretty bad position to actually be sending other states medical equipment. Brussels doesn't have it. The member states are mostly using it for them. But I think if we look at the next 2-3 years, the EU will become much more important in helping the economies of the countries of the Western Balkans and the Eastern Partnership to survive. And we'll probably have several years of an economic crisis ahead. And of course, Russia will not be running around offering cheap loans or assistance to countries. China will do this very, very selectively. The United States, well, remains to be seen what will happen in the United States. But I think as the attention of these countries will move towards handling the economic crisis rather than the medical crisis, the relative importance of the EU will go significantly up. But this will also raise to the EU some dilemmas as to how much unconditional assistance are you actually ready to give. Of course, it's in the EU's interest not to have the countries collapsing, not have its neighbors go into bankruptcy, just like Lebanon did a month ago. So the EU has an interest in helping these countries, but also the EU has an interest in balancing that with continuing insistence on reforms, on anti-corruption, on democracy standards. So I think that will be important in the next couple of years to see and for the EU to get this balance right. Assistance, we close our eyes to conditionality now in the immediate aftermath of COVID, but with time, the EU also will need, and within a few months, the EU will need to get back on track on actually insisting on some type of conditionality without which it cannot be just distributing money to states in its neighborhood.
Thank you so much, everybody, for your insights and your great ideas. Unfortunately, we're already a bit behind our schedule, so we still have quite a few questions also from the audience, but I know that you have quite busy schedules these days, even more busy than usual. So I really hope that we will be able to meet soon at events in offline rather than online. And I wish you all to stay safe and healthy and stay strong. And we are all together in that, and it all depends on us and our responsibilities. So thank you again for our audience and for being active, setting up the questions. So please follow our activities online. We are continuing with our online events and webinars. It's all published on our social media activities. Follow also the hashtag #GlobSecGoesDigital. And once again, thank you all, and thank you to our great panelists, and a round of applause to you, which are not heard, but they are with you, and hope to see you soon at another event.